And welcome to WizeUp. My name's Paul Arthur, and I am super excited to actually have our very first edition of WizeUp going to air here. So, yep, I'm pumped. What is WizeUp all about? And I want to say, well, I think we all need to wise up to a certain degree, right? I mean, if I can put up my hand to that one for sure. We want to ask the why questions. Why are things the way they are? And what can you and I do to bring about change to the way things are? Our world today, I mean, it is so polarized, right? Like never before. I mean, we have so many different worldviews happening, cultural clashes, all kinds of things that way. And what comes out of that, it seems, is so much anger, okay? And we call each other names. We put each other down. We cancel one another. People get fired over their views these days, okay? So, whatever happened to the values that we used to have, like civil debate? Have some conversations about our differences. Have a healthy, robust debate. Okay, here's why I see things differently. And at the end of the day, we can go out and have a coffee together and still be friends, okay? That's kind of the way it used to be. It's okay to disagree. So I'm hoping that this program will actually bring about some influence to viewers to return to this tradition. So with that in mind, I am so happy to introduce our very first guest, and that is Dr. Sean McDowell. Okay, he is, I think, just a perfect fit for WizeUp. Okay, now, if you've never heard of Dr. Sean McDowell, I'm sure you probably have, but in case you haven't, he is a professor of Christian apologetics at Biola University in Southern California. He's a best-selling author. He speaks around the globe on issues related to culture, apologetics, and Gen Z, and I encourage you to check out his Think Biblically podcast. My girls watch it, so you know what? It must be good. And his latest book is co-authored with Tim Muehlhoff. It's called End the Stalemate, Move Past Cancel Culture to Meaningful Conversations. And you can check that out at seanmcdowell.org. That's where you can get a hold of the book. So, Sean, thank you so much for being with us today.
Paul, it's a treat to be back, and congratulations on the new show. I appreciate being the first or one of the first guests.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you here because it just fits in so much with what I'm hoping this show will do. Can you start off by giving us a working definition of what cancel culture is?
Yeah, cancel culture is typically a term to grasp the idea that if somebody says something or does something that's deemed unacceptable, then often through social media, people will pile on that person to wreck their reputation, wreck their job, or maybe force some kind of, public apology and repentance. That's really probably roughly what most people would agree cancel culture is.
Okay. Well, it seems to me this cancel culture, the polarization in Canada and the U.S. and other nations around the world too, to a certain degree, it seems like it's increasing, not decreasing, right? So why?
Well, I think you're right about that. It's interesting. I was asked to speak on cancel culture in the Philippines this summer, and I
Oh,
thought, I'm an
wow.
American. What do I know about Philippine culture?
Yeah.
And I started doing some research, and I found the same kind of phenomena that people are afraid to say certain things politically on certain moral issues, that their friends would cancel them. And in some cases, there were instances where people were concerned about their jobs. So I think behind cancel culture, whenever I hear a new term like this, I first ask what you asked. What does this term mean? And why do we have it right now? And as best I can tell, I think there's a few factors that are contributing to this. I call it the perfect storm in the book. One of them is that we just have a massive number of people who are hurting and who are broken. We've heard about fatherlessness, depression, anxiety. There are hurting people. And you've heard it said, it's been attributed to Rick Warren, but it goes even back before him, that hurt people hurt people. In some ways, cancel culture is a result of the fact that we just have a relational and emotionally broken society, and that is the US and Canada and beyond. And if people don't learn how to love and treat others, they're going to default to canceling others. I think that's one piece of it. Of course, a huge piece is just social media. The mere fact that now that we all have access to the world through a range of different social media platforms, that in the past, there were certain gatekeepers to communicate. And now anybody can say anything, anytime, anywhere. And if someone says something that others don't like, you can also pile on that person and try to silence that person and send a message that that idea is not welcome here. I think the third reason is we just have such a polarized culture. And I speak more of the US, but I sense this is probably true in Canada and beyond. But there's certain issues now, whether it's politically, whether it's morally, that there is division not only between the church and the culture, but within the church itself. And there's a range of
Hmm.
issues. I mean, Black Lives Matter in terms of the organization and all that went around that really just that wasn't the cause of it, but that just precipitated such a deep division that's been in American culture and beyond for a while. And people are just so divided and upset about this. Within the church, there's differences how to approach a range of issues. So if you kind of step back and think about it, we all have a medium to communicate our ideas. There's more polarization than we've ever had. We have unhealthy people. And then on top of that, I think we've just simply lost the ability how to communicate with one another. We don't know basic tools of communication, how to effective well. So when you kind of put these pieces together, I'd be surprised if we didn't have a kind of cancel culture.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Surprised that wouldn't be happening. I mean, here it is. Yeah. So there's some reasons behind it. Again, the hurting people thing, the clashing worldviews, social media. I mean, you even go so far as to say that it encourages us to dehumanize others. Yikes. When there's kind of a gang mentality, we'll all jump on it. We'll pile on, right?
I think dehumanization is a good word because on social media, what's allowed, and I'm not saying this because I'm against it. I use social media and I love
Okay.
it. So
Mm-hmm.
there's strengths and there's weaknesses, but it's just a screen. It's just an image. Sometimes people don't even use their real handles on social media.
Right.
So I remember, I mean, in the 90s, when people first started getting these chat rooms, and I was a student at Biola, I was watching my roommate communicate with somebody going, you would never say this to somebody in the flesh, but you're
Yep.
just typing away saying things. And this was long before social media. So it really does, it strips away seeing somebody face to face, and they're just a handle, they're an image, they're a number. And we end up just treating people in a fashion that we forget that is a human being we're
Yeah.
talking about. So that idea you just said is right. In many ways, it dehumanizes people.
Yeah. That's not a good thing. You mentioned that progressive thinkers have a tendency to, I mean, when they look at, Christian viewpoints, they tend to be intolerant of that or maybe intolerant of conservative viewpoints.
I do think what we used to call tolerance really was the idea that, hey, we can agree to disagree. And it's like, I might say to my wife, okay, I'll tolerate tomatoes on the salad, even though I don't like them and I don't want them there. Okay, I'll tolerate it, or I'll tolerate certain music that I don't like. Built into the idea of tolerance is the idea that I actually think you're wrong or I don't like something, but I will tolerate it. Now that's not often the case. I mean, we've seen issues all over the place in the news where, in particular, oftentimes conservatives and Christians are singled out for their views on marriage and family and sometimes on sexuality. And the message is very clear. It's not live and let live, but that idea is not acceptable. There is no tolerance for that. So cancel culture can be a strategy where people pile on and try to shame somebody, make them feel bad, and stop speaking. And then other people are watching this phenomena thinking, I don't want to get piled on like that too. So maybe I just won't say anything.
Mm. Now, as Christians and as conservatives, we have to look in the mirror as well. Are we guilty of doing the same thing at times?
You know, I'm really glad you brought this up. In the back of my mind, while you were asking that question, was that I don't just want to pile on those on the left. I think you also see it on the right. And I don't even just mean the far right. I think you'll see it within the church sometimes. It's a human phenomena that we see taking place because we have people broken within the church, people with social media within the church. We have different viewpoints within the church. And frankly, it's just easier sometimes to cancel somebody and react than it is to reach out and do the hard work and engage somebody in person. So I appreciate that balance. It's important that we don't just point to the other side. And I have no studies that say who does it more, the left or the right.
Right.
I don't know the answer to that. I have an opinion on it, but the bottom line is we see it all over the place and should be consistent and look in the mirror and ask ourselves if we're doing that as well. And by the way, I actually think when it comes to cancel culture, there's two unhealthy responses we can have. One is to say, well, if they're going to cancel me, I'm going to jump on the cancel culture and cancel them back in a knee-jerk, thoughtless, reactive fashion. The other is to start living in fear that people are going to cancel us. I think both of those are unhealthy responses to cancel culture.
It does take courage, doesn't it? What comes to mind is Harrison Butker, right? Kansas Chiefs, great field goal kicker, et cetera. But he happened to speak his mind at I think it was a Catholic, university commencement speech, and he spoke his mind on some moral issues, and was also talking about women. Young ladies choosing motherhood, and wow, that caused a lot of controversy. He's taken all kinds of heat for sharing his viewpoints, and he's not backing down, which is interesting. So he's not giving into the fear.
Well, he is an amazing kicker. He's had quite the record.
Oh yeah.
And he's a Catholic, and he was speaking at Benedictine College's graduation to Catholics. And he said there's a few things I said. I'm like, okay, I would have worded that differently, whatever. He started off by saying, I'm not a professional speaker. I didn't want to do this, but I'm doing it for a friend. I'm a kicker. He goes, and then he started critiquing people outside of the church. I mean, he didn't mention it by name, but he blatantly critiqued the U.S. president for claiming to be a Catholic, but then being pro, certain ideas related to the unborn and sexuality. But then he turned and he started spending more time critiquing those within the Catholic Church, which is his tribe, for also being political and not boldly speaking truth and not being true Catholics. So he criticized both sides in his speech. But I thought it was so interesting that some people lost their minds over the fact that he said, ladies, I want to speak to you of what I consider some of the most diabolical lies spoken to you. So these are college graduate women. He said, I venture to say that most of you are thinking about your careers, but you're also thinking more about the kind of family and children that you will raise that will bring you happiness. Now, why is that so controversial? I mean, he's speaking to Catholics. It's a Catholic idea. But some people want to silence and shut that down. There was a petition, I don't know how many thousands or tens of thousands of people signed it to try to get him fired.
Yeah.
But a piece of that is to discourage anybody else from speaking up and sharing their minds. Because Butker has a lot of money. He's got fame. He's got Mahomes, his teammate, who defends him. And so did the coach, which, so he has a certain level of capital. But there's a lot of people looking out there going, I don't have a social media following. I don't have that money. Nobody knows who I am.
Right.
Maybe I just shouldn't speak up and say anything. And a part of cancel culture is to instill that fear, I think, in people's minds.
I really appreciate people like him. Actually, I'll tell you what I appreciate too is that he had some support from, some unexpected sources. I mean, non-Christians, for example. Some of the Kelseys, for example, are kind of known for a little more of a rowdier lifestyle, that sort of thing. But they're saying, hey, you know what? I don't agree with everything he's saying, maybe with none of what he's saying, but I appreciate him because you know what? He treats people with respect. We see him every day throughout the year. And you know what? He's sharing his mind, and that's okay. So we kind of have this attitude that, unless you agree with me, you shouldn't be able to share, your opinions. No. we need to have freedom for everyone to share their thoughts and be respectful to one another, right? I mean, let me ask, should we listen to other viewpoints, even though we might find them incredibly offensive? I mean, if we do or if we don't listen, we're communicating something, aren't we?
So I think we should listen to other viewpoints. Now, if a person is intentionally offensive, then I might just not want to listen to
Okay.
him. If the person has an axe to grind and maybe hates Christians and just communicates in a kind of disgust, then I don't really have a lot of room for that. Like it's just
Okay.
that emotional energy.
Right.
But you better believe we need to listen to a podcast of people who see the world differently. Follow YouTube channels of people who see the world differently. Read books of people who see the world differently. Have conversations with people who see the world differently. I mean, look, we shouldn't be afraid of talking with people because if they're actually right, then we might get closer to discovering the truth. But when we just put an echo chamber around ourselves, then the other side just seems stupid and we think they're just
Hmm.
dumb and they've lost their minds. I mean, if you just listen to certain news channels and certain podcasts, that's an echo chamber, then those people in the other political party, those other faiths, they are just idiots. They're destroying the country. Well, you know what? When I spend time talking with people who see the world differently, I still disagree with them. And we have the kind of substantive conversations that you framed this new show around. But then I start to speak about this issue differently. I don't set up a straw man. I try to represent their views more accurately. But also, when I speak about these other groups, like I don't just say atheists as a whole, I think of individual friends that I have who are atheists. So not only do I not think it's wrong to read other views and listen to other perspectives, I think we need to, as Christians, to do so in a way of loving our neighbors in this pluralistic world we live in, who many of them do see the world very differently than we do. So I actually ask people, Paul, I'll sometimes I'll ask Christians, I'll say, take out your phone and look at the news apps that you follow. Look
Hmm.
at the podcasts that you follow. Look at the YouTube channels you follow. Are they all people that agree with you?
Hmm.
Like, there's something missing if that's the kind of people we surround ourselves with in our lives.
Well, it's a little bit like, Jesus being confronted about hanging out with the sinners and the tax collectors, you know?
Mm.
Not sure if I want to hang out with tax collectors personally, but, we do actually need to hang out with people who are different than we are. And I mean, part of that is just getting, opportunities to share the good news with other people. But it's also, you know what? None of us live a perfect life. I teach my kids often to say, you know what? If we're not open to the possibility that I'm wrong, how will I ever find, a deeper level of truth? I need to be listening to other people. They might know some things that I don't.
Amen to that. I think it's Proverbs 18:20 that says, the first to speak in court sounds right
Hmm.
until the cross examination begins. If I
Yeah.
only listen to people that agree with me, I'm not allowing any cross examination. I'm not going to see my blind spots and weaknesses and areas I need to grow in. And I'm also not going to understand people. I'm not one of my favorite interviews on YouTube, probably 2 or 3 years ago, a really successful businessman. He said, when people view the world differently than I do, I assume that they have good reasons for this.
Hmm.
And I thought, that's really charitable. Now, I might think those reasons are wrong, but in their mind, they're good reasons. And they probably are good reasons insofar as they go. And so if I just only listen to people that agree with me, I'm just never going to get in the heart and mind of somebody else. And I think really able to love them as a neighbor.
Hmm. Wow. Well, if you're just tuning in here, we're talking with Dr. Sean McDowell. He's written a book called Move Past Cancel Culture to Meaningful Conversations. I want to encourage you to check that out. Again, SeanMcDowell.org is where you can get the book, and you can also check out some of his podcasts there as well. You talk in the book about a need for a communication climate. Interesting term. I'm thinking to myself, we need to understand that people who see things very differently than we do, I think they actually do care about the situation that you're disagreeing on, or the people involved. They actually do care. They may have very different ideas on how to solve the issues, but if we can acknowledge that they care, that changes the climate, doesn't it?
I think it does. So my co-author on End the Stalemate is Tim Muehlhoff, and he is a PhD in communication. Did his
Mm.
PhD at University of North Carolina. So not with Christian scholars, some of the top scholars in the world in the area in which he studied. And one of the things he put into this book, because I have a lot of stories and practice doing this, he brought the scholarship and just talked about communication climate. What's
Mm.
the communication climate in a family? What's the communication climate at work? There are certain under the surface factors that allow us to have meaningful conversations. And that's what we call the climate. So to have a conversation with somebody, it's got to be in the right time, it's got to be in the right place. We have to build and work at creating a communication climate for conversation to take place. Now, we could talk about how do you build that? Well, it'd be interesting to ask like your kids someday, what do you think is the communication climate in our family? In other words, do we communicate well? How can we communicate better? What are some times that I've communicated with you well to a son or daughter? What are some times that I didn't communicate well? Like asking these kinds of questions reveals
Yeah.
that there actually is a culture that either is leaning towards good communication or pushing against it. So, are we working to break down barriers and make good communication more possible? That's kind of the meta level question that really the success of a conversation in large part is going to rest upon if we've done the hard work of creating a climate in the first place where that
Yeah.
successful conversation can take place.
Right. So you got to have that climate in place. And then again, that meaningful conversation. Do you want to unpack that a little bit for us? I mean, what does that look like, practically speaking?
Well, in part, what we're aiming for. I mean, we titled the book "End the Stalemate" because whether it's politically, whether it's
Hmm.
religiously, whether it's relationally, we are just in a moment where we're just at odds with one another. There's division and there's assumptions and there's hatred sometimes and contempt on different sides. So there literally is a stalemate
Hmm.
in conversation. But I think what you said earlier is really true, Paul. I actually think most people, whatever their worldview is, are open to and even want to have meaningful conversations.
I think you're right.
And I think that I I think the reason it doesn't happen is because of stereotypes on different sides, because of poor communication, because we just don't lean in and lead the way as Christians how to have these type of conversations. And so I think most people would talk about controversial things. Now, how does this happen? Well, one of the things in the book that is my favorite thing, Paul, this is when Tim shared this idea with me. That's when I said, okay, I'm in. This was one of the ideas that hooked me to write this book with him. It's this idea of perspective taking. Now, perspective taking is when you step into somebody else's shoes and truly try to see the world as they do and articulate it as they do. But it's not just mental. You try to feel what they feel in their perspective. Now, this is a very biblical idea because we have a God who has descended, so to speak, given up power, it tells us in Philippians chapter 2, taken on human flesh. And then, as Hebrews 4 tells us, we have a high priest who understands us in every way and yet was without sin. So we have a God who's kind of stepped into our shoes and taken our perspective. What if we were to take a similar incarnational approach with people? And step number one was just to say, help me see the world as you see the world. That's transformative, Paul. I mean, actually, it was M. Scott Peck who said the way to love somebody is just to listen. In our
Hmm.
distracted, angry, divided culture again,
Wow.
some people just want to be heard and they want to be understood. My dad said to me, I don't know that it was original with him, but I've heard him say many times, it's more important to understand than it is to be understood. What if we Christians just said, I just want to understand where you're coming from? Now, with that said, I think there's reasons why we don't do this. And I think one reason is we think that listening to somebody means we're affirming that person.
Right.
And I just want to say understanding doesn't equal affirmation. That's not what it means. And so I think if we'd be willing to step into people's shoes, try to see and feel the world as they do,
Mm.
minimally it'd make us more empathetic. It would create a climate of communication where that person is now going to feel like, gosh, you
Yep.
really understand me. Now
Yep.
I feel the need to reciprocate and try to understand you. And we can at least have conversations about the issues that matter most.
Yeah, I mean, wow. And somebody's got to take that first step to actually listen respectfully and kindly, compassionately. And that falls on us as followers of Christ, So, I mean, wow. I mean, I know you write in the book here, too, you've got friends, I mean, who are atheists, and you spend time with them and you genuinely care for them. You're not, it's just not another, notch on the gun sort of thing. You're expressing care for them. I'm up against the clock here. It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Sean. Again, Dr. Sean McDowell. And I do encourage you to check out his website, seanmcdowell.org, and his podcast. And the book is called End the Stalemate, Move Past Cancel Culture to Meaningful Conversations, as we just heard about here. So, wow. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thanks for having me on, and congrats on the new show.
Thank you. And appreciate you watching here as well. I encourage you to check it out. Tell your friends about it, wiseup.ca or returntoreason.com or wherever you watch or listen to your podcasts. Thank you so much. Send us any comments you have, any suggestions you have. God bless.